Okay,
There's Karen.
so 6:30, we'll call to order the meeting of the Ramsey-Washington Metro Watershed District. First order of business, do we have anybody to introduce? We have you.
Yeah, and we do have a few visitors, it looks like, one in person and two online here
Okay,
as well.
so shall we go around the table and introduce
Sure.
ourselves? Well, I'm Larry Swope. I'm the president and Watershed District Manager.
I'm Diane Ward, and I'm the vice president.
Matt Kramer, manager of the district.
Pam Skinner, manager of the district.
I'm Andy Herring from Redpath and Company,
Oh, yeah,
the
okay.
CPA firm.
Yep.
And Tina Carson's administrator.
Thanks, Brad. Kimberly Horn.
Thank you.
Okay,
Paige.
Yeah, Paige Alberg from the Watershed District Project Manager.
Lauren.
Lauren Kirshner, attorney for district.
Bill.
I'm Bill Ratoja. I'm the Natural Resources Specialist for the Watershed.
Nicole.
Hi, Nicole Soderholm. I'm permit coordinator with the Watershed.
Kyle.
Hi, I'm Kyle Kibitza. I'm a water quality technician with the Watershed District.
Aaron.
Hi, everybody. I'm Erin Anderson-Wenz with Bar Engineering Company, and my colleague Sam Redinger will be also joining from Bar later in the meeting.
Right there. Dave.
David Lawson, district staff.
Then I have somebody that says Will F's iPhone.
Yeah, that's Will Forboard with Loeffler Construction and Consulting. Here, if you guys have any questions on the Battle Creek item agenda.
Okay, thanks, Will. And Bert. Bert, are you there? Sam, do you want to? Oh, there's.
Yeah, sorry about that. Bert Johnson, Twin Lake Association.
And Sam, do you want to introduce yourself?
Hi, Sam Redinger, civil engineer with Bar Engineering.
That's everyone.
great. So that's everybody. Is anybody going to speak during the visitors' comments?
Yes, Bert.
Okay, thanks, Bert. So the first item of business is approval of the agenda. Do I have a motion to approve the agenda? So moved.
Second.
Second. Any discussion? You take anything out, move anything around? Okay, all in favor, say aye.
Aye.
Opposed, no. Passed. Consent agenda. Do I have a motion to approve the consent agenda?
I'll move to approve the consent agenda.
Second? So moved. So moved. Any discussion? Anybody want to take anything out of it? Or have any comments on it?
I don't want to take anything out, but Nicole, I was just wondering on the Bielenberg office permit, you know, that's kind of carried on. Were you pleased with how the wetland turned out that they did at that earlier stage?
Do you mean the incidental
Yeah,
designation? Yeah, that's generally preferred to get the wetland approvals out of the way. Other kinds of wetland approvals might take, a longer comment period through the Wetland Conservation Act. So definitely like to have those issues buttoned up nice and tidy before it would come to you for approval.
thank you.
Okay, any other discussion? All in favor of approving the consent agenda, say aye.
Aye.
Opposed, no. Passes. Come to item number 4, visitor comments. Bert, you're up.
All right, thanks, everybody. Sorry if I don't come through loud and clear. So Bert Johnson, I'm president of the Twin Lake Association, and we formed when Twin Lake was went through inundation from West Vadnais. And at that time, there was not an outlet, though there was a historic outlet, ditch 16 on Twin Lake. So we formed around three things, which is to prevent inundation of Twin Lake, to restore and ensure that the outlet that there is an outlet on Twin Lake and it's functioning, and the water quality of Twin Lake. And I'm speaking to the board today, and I appreciate the time and consideration just to address one specific issue related to the operations plan of the weir. This is the first spring where we really will see the operations plan tested. And up until the last couple of years, the Twin Lake had really just been kind of like a quiet area within the watershed district because there had been historic kind of really non-issues at Twin Lake. And when West Vadnais inundated Twin Lake and water levels were very high all around the district, we raised a lot of concerns. There was some pumping by the city of Little Canada, and eventually the watershed invested in installing a weir on the pond at the southeast side of Twin Lake. In order for that operations plan to happen, the operations plan references a water level or water elevation on Twin Lake, but not the pond. And the concern, and I'm asking on behalf of the Twin Lake Association, that the board take a look at the operations plan, given that it addresses the elevation of Twin Lake and not the pond that the weir is situated on. And it's for one main reason, and that is that in the spring, and since the weir was installed, Mondello Shores development has been developed, and it's completely changed the land. There used to be water sitting all over, and now, especially with greater rainfalls, there are more impervious surfaces, more treated lawns, so more chemical runoff into that pond. And the pond level rises far faster than Twin Lake. When it does that, it goes through the railroad culvert, which historically it did not do because ditch 16 would have already moved that water out of the pond. There was no pond. It would have flowed directly into Jarvis Creek through ditch 16 and out, not back into Twin. So that is not a historical norm that water would flow back into Twin Lake. So the issue is in the spring, especially the early spring, Twin Lake is receiving water from that pond through the railroad culvert. And as Twin Lake now is rising due to waterfalls and the previous backflow from the pond, we now have additional water in Twin Lake that didn't need to be there in the first place, that under the operations plan would be moved back downstream. And actually the non-functioning of the operations plan based on the pond level earlier in the season creates risk both for Twin Lake, but especially downstream, because it just pushes more water into Twin Lake and then has to move it back out through the weir. So I think it's worth exploring to try to normalize the pond and Twin Lake.
Okay.
Point Twin is sort of a holding area for water, all the runoff in the area. So just asking the board to take a look at that and probably some informal conversations would help as they have in the past. I reached out to Tina, but far too late before this meeting, and appreciate your time. And we're all kind of waiting with bated breath. But we really want the operations plan to work and want the weir to work and work with the watershed to make that happen. Thanks.
Okay, thanks, Bert. Follow up on that. Tina, do you have any information on what he was talking about, checking it out, or can we have it re-reviewed, or should we?
Well, I
or-
think any operations plan should be reviewed periodically.
It's a new one.
It's a new operations plan. This is the first season. I mean, it was written the way it is written now for a reason, and we understand how the flow has actually historically come from Mandela Shores and into Twin.
Right.
That was actually historic, even with the ditch 16 there. We recreated that situation when we put in the swale and the outlet. So it's operating as we anticipated it to, expected it to, modeled it to, based on water levels. Actually, Twin Lake levels they're a little higher right now, but they're decreasing. So it's at a point now where that water, even if there is water coming in from the pond, which it's been a little bit, a trickle, I would say, or a small amount from the pond into Twin Lake, water levels are decreasing. We're not seeing it reach that outlet elevation. It can't get through the railroad pipe. It can't get back to that outlet. So the operation of the outlet isn't controlling the water levels on Twin right now.
Okay. So bottom line, is there a need to review the plan? We should review the
I
plan?
don't think right now would be the time to review it. I think we should go through a season, and the City of Little Canada will be tracking when they open, when they close it. We can see all the water levels. We have the water level monitoring station on there. We can compare that to rain events. And also, I think it would be best to get through a season. I don't think there is a imminent need right now to review it.
Okay.
Also, there was some comments about, the impervious surfaces, and you'll remember that Mandela Shores came through for a permit. So they have infiltration, they have filtration, they have holding ponds, they have a number of water quality benefits on that site that wasn't there prior to the development. So I wouldn't expect that water quality to be worse than it was before the project was. I
Okay.
would guess it would be better.
So then, to Bert's point, since Bert's still there,
Yeah.
we can keep in contact with them and
Mhm.
look at reviewing the plan at the end of the year when we have more information.
Mhm.
Just make sure that it works according to how it's
Mhm.
supposed to.
Yep. Right now, we'll operate it as it's written, and then we can compare the results, I guess, looking at. Again, it's not controlling the water levels on Twin right now. I understand they're concerned about water coming from Mandela into Twin and then back out, but that is a historical pattern. So
Is it worthwhile to have a meeting with the Lake Association?
I'm happy to. I've talked with Bert a few times, and I talked to Val recently as well, but I'm happy to. Mhm.
Okay, Bert, is that acceptable if Tina has a meeting with you, with your association, kind of explains what the situation is?
Yes, yeah, and because I think the issue is mainly right now, it's just the pond is not, the pond level is not a factor. I understand it. I understand there was some historic backflow. We don't know that it's the same water quality as is there now. That's never been measured. And so I mean, I understand what Tina's saying. I do, and that's what I expected to hear. But I think it's worth talking through with people in the neighborhood and figuring out what it looks like. This is not just the first year of that outlet, but it's also the first year where Mandela Shores has moved in, and people are seeing different things happen than what they expected. So we would welcome the conversation.
Okay, all right. So the action step, you'll get with Bert, decide how we want to communicate this, and then look at the plan
Mhm.
going forward.
Yep. And I
Okay,
can update you next month on
okay,
what comes of that.
great.
There's somebody else that jumped on, Heather. Heather, were you here to speak?
Not to speak, just listening. I'm on the association with Bert, so.
Okay, thanks,
Okay.
Heather.
Thanks. Okay, so action step, we'll get with Bert. We'll have some feedback from that, and as usual, look at the plan after we've had it, unless of course something happens.
Yep.
Okay, item 5, permit program. We have the Battle Creek Park improvements. Therefore, any?
Want Nicole to give some background?
Yeah, Nicole, can you give a little background on this for us?
Sure. Yeah, this permit application was not included in the consent agenda because they are requesting a variance for temporary wetland buffer disturbance. The wetlands were delineated and approved by the city of St. Paul, which is the LGU for wetland issues. But they also had to demonstrate compliance with our buffer. So there's a variance request included. This is Ramsey County Parks property, so they will be heavily involved in the restoration of that disturbance to make sure that it's the high quality vegetation that they would expect on their parkland. Other than that, as far as the general scope of the project, as I understand, they're kind of trying to create a better sledding and skiing destination in the section of the park. So there will be some grading. The majority of the work on the trails or ski paths, they're existing grass trails, and they're looking to mow a little bit wider. So there's no actual other change besides that. Fairly relative, small amount of impervious with the addition of a new maintenance building and a small drive area. So they are proposing a filtration BMP to treat runoff. But I would be happy to answer any questions.
I did have one kind of question in reading through the thing. What is a wet pond with filtration bench? Just briefly.
Yeah, so they weren't able to infiltrate on the site due to poor soils. So the water will run into sort of a holding pond and then kind of rise up over this filtration bench that surrounds the perimeter of the pond. And it will get treated that way when the water spills over that bench area.
Okay.
A flat area around the pond, and then it can drain through it and filter.
Okay.
Is it a special material, that bench, that
You know, I don't recall, but I believe it would be like a sand filtration section.
You can jump in if you have anything you want to.
Yeah.
Yeah. I think this was a project we saw on a tour that we took a few years ago, wasn't it? That they were preparing to do all of this work.
Yeah.
And I think we
Because
Or the park
walked
store.
around.
Yeah.
Yeah, John Owinagi, I think, took us on.
talking about this for about 5 or 6 years.
Yeah, I know.
and I recall on the tour, they were talking about making these improvements would allow them to have some pretty high level ski, cross-country ski races. I don't
That's their
know,
hope.
that's their hope.
Mhm.
Anyway, with being able to attract some outside groups too.
Mhm.
Okay, any other discussion? Do I have a motion to approve permit number 2218?
Sure, I'll move we approve.
Second,
I'll second.
any further discussion? All in favor, say aye.
I
All opposed, no. The application passes.
Just to be clear, you voted no on the.
No, I voted yes.
Oh, okay.
No, I said,
Oh, gotcha.
Well, I said-
I just want to make sure I got the vote right on.
this is why I actually like to have a roll call.
Yeah.
Because what I said was, all in favor, say aye.
And then-
All opposed, say no. And I said aye. But you
Okay.
can't tell.
Yeah, just making sure.
Just want to make sure that
Thank
I got everybody.
Yeah.
Because the voice vote's a little complicated.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Mhm.
I'm glad you clarified
Yeah.
that.
Thanks for coming.
I don't want to be the bad guy.
No.
All right, further on the enforcement action report. Nicole, anything to talk about there?
Yeah, Mary and I both attended a couple certification trainings. And then we'll talk about it later on the agenda, but I was working on preparing the MS4 draft annual report, which we can talk about later, but working on compiling that information from different staff. So yeah, if there's any questions on meetings or project updates.
Nothing from me. Anybody have any other comments on any of the things going on? Didn't have anything in that area. Okay, thank you. Stewardship Grant Program. Comments? We're using our money rather quickly this year. It's good. It's a good thing.
Yeah, we've had a couple smaller projects approved since the last board meeting, just at the staff level, and then the 2 tonight. I don't know of any other big ones coming through. That doesn't mean that won't happen, but I think right now we're sitting pretty good for the residential projects that should still come through this year.
Okay.
Paige, I was wondering if the master water stewards, if you're expecting something from them, we usually get something, or is that a little later in this season?
Yeah, Sage is working with, I think the master water steward this year lives in Woodbury, so hopefully he's going to do a rain garden on his property. That's the only one I've heard of so far. I don't even know how many she has this year, but that's the only one that's in the planning docket right now.
And do you have some priority area projects you're trying to get going or get interested in?
Well, yeah, so I guess we're targeting, Lake Owasso will be our next round that we're targeting specifically. I've talked with Lauren, our communication person, about doing some outreach kind of in our equity areas on the east side of St. Paul and getting some outreach there. But that's kind of it right now for stewardship grants, project specific. Looking at more kind of the larger targeted retrofit projects later this summer, getting those set up for next year or the year after.
What's the strategy for targeting and outreach in the equity areas?
Yeah, we haven't quite got those details yet. It'll most likely be, we want to pick, determine the area, and then Lauren has access to next door. We can do, we're debating mailings. Those aren't always the most successful outreach, but trying to figure out other ways to spread the word in those areas. Maybe go to some farmers markets, work with our water stewards or CAC members to go to different events that are held out there. Yeah, kind of spread the word that way.
The district councils too in St. Paul are a good resource that we've been tapping into as well.
And are there any habitat homes in that area that are being worked on this summer? They often coordinate with the master gardeners, and that might be a way to get some projects going.
Yeah, like Habitat for Humanity.
Right.
Yeah, not that I'm aware of, but I can see how to look into that. I know a lot of times, a lot of those have been in Capital Region Watershed in the past, so they've worked with them. We've had a couple that I can think of. It's been a few years, but yeah, something I can look into.
Yeah, maybe they have a contact, maybe Cap Region does, who works on that you could just kind of put a bug in their ear and tell them our geographic areas and let us know.
Yeah, we've worked with them, or we've connected with them through them before. Yep.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, good. Anything else from anybody on that item? Moving along to item 7A, review and accept the 2021 district annual financial.
Yes, and Andy, as you requested, is here in person live.
Right.
And he's going to go over a couple items with you and then answer any questions you have.
Okay.
All right, thank you. Good evening. Just a quick recap of the audit, and I've got two main things to address here, but a couple of reports that we issue. It's an annual financial report of the district. Near the front of that is our opinion on the financial statements for 2021. It's an unmodified opinion, also known as a clean opinion. That's the highest level of opinion you can receive. So good news there. Near the back then of this document, there's a report on internal control, which really relates to the financial policies and procedures of the organization. And that's where this year we have one finding, and that's, I handed out the actual finding 2021-1. So there was a correction that was made actually to last year's financial statements. And during the audit, we dug into the fixed assets or the infrastructure and determined that in the past, some of the amounts that were capitalized or recorded there was a few things, but some of them were based on estimates. And this year we kind of figured out what the actual costs were. So we trued that up. There was, I think, a project or two that in the past we thought was not an asset of Ramsey-Washington, but determined it was an asset. So there was some cleanup things which resulted in really restating the opening equity. And ideally, those things would have been recorded correctly. It's from 2019 and 2020. So some cleanup was done this past year so that those items are now correctly reported.
Okay, are these like lots of different projects or one or two big ones? And
There were, if I remember right, I think there were 2 or 3 projects. There weren't a lot, but there were a couple.
The biggest one was our lake level monitoring stations.
okay,
And part of that was spread out over a number of years too. So it was a different way that we incorrectly thought we would wait till the projects were complete and then we would capitalize the assets. But in some cases, product was bought in previous years, or there was, it should have been in a previous statement. So that's something like Andy was saying, we've cleaned up our tracking of these projects. Some of it gets a little tricky because we do a lot of projects on other people's property. And so they don't necessarily become an asset of ours, but we might be maintaining things, but we don't own them, or, there's a lot of different ways that we look at that. So it was definitely a cleanup of some of those items. So that was the one, I think the biggest one.
there's something about government grants too coming over.
Yeah,
Wasn't
the
there
grants.
$117,000?
There was a few grants where, yes, originally in 2021, the expenditures had been recorded, but for instances where they could be reimbursed by grants, the revenue, the corresponding revenue had not been recorded.
Oh,
So
okay.
some additional revenue was recorded in 2021 versus recording it in 2022. So it's really a timing of when that revenue got recorded. It wasn't an issue, was not an issue of the revenue was missed. It was more just the timing of when that revenue was recorded. Yep. So those items have been corrected. Last in this report is a report of compliance, a Minnesota legal compliance report where we test compliance with state statutes, and there were no findings there. The other report that we issue is a audit management letter. Probably one of the most noteworthy things in here is a discussion on the need for reserves. As you know, the largest revenue source is property taxes, and the first payment isn't received until July 1st. So you really need reserves to operate for that first half of the year. And then it's always good policy to have reserves for emergency situations. So that explains this. And then, as you know, occasionally projects don't happen when they were scheduled to happen. They get delayed. So there can be a buildup of fund balance. Then another piece of the audit that I understand you'd like a little explanation on. Back in, I think it was back in 2013, there was this is the other one-page handout that I issued. This is a standard for auditors and what we need to do to our consideration of whether there's any fraud in financial statements. So every year we're required to ask somebody on the board Are you aware of any fraud? Do you have suspicions of anything occurring? So those are routine inquiries that we make. New this year, there was a completely separate standard that required us to ask about related party transactions, which could pose a potential conflict of interest. And I think maybe how those questions were asked, it maybe implied that the fraud standard was new. But no, this fraud standard has been in existence about 10 years. So related to the fraud standard, those were standard questions. We didn't have any suspicions that fraud did occur, and we don't. I mean, we didn't detect anything. But I did print out that this is the first page of the standard. It just kind of describes, fraud would be intentional misstatement, whether it's fraudulent financial reporting or a misuse of assets. And then paragraph 4 there gets into the responsibility for prevention and detection of fraud. The primary responsibility rests with the board and management. And I don't think you're ever going to find something specifically that says board members have to do X, Y, and Z to prevent fraud. But it discusses a little bit here, really setting an appropriate tone at the top, maintaining oversight with policies. It is important that management, with the oversight of those charged with governance, which would be the board members, places a strong emphasis on fraud prevention. This involves a commitment to creating a culture of honesty and ethical behavior, which can be reinforced by active oversight, which could include consideration for potential override of controls. So, if you can have controls in place, procedures in place, but if they aren't followed, you could get into trouble there. So on the front end, it's that tone at the top, adopting appropriate policies. On the back end, it could be the board's review of disbursements, making sure that the amount of money going out the door seems reasonable, the amounts, and to the proper vendors. So I would say that's the most common way fraud could occur, is payment to inappropriate folks or companies.
So that's what we do review the check register and disbursements and everything every month. Kind of miss Cliff, because Cliff always did in detail, but yeah, that's and I mentioned that to you when you talked to me. That's the primary way. I've never seen anything. I often have things that come up that I wonder what they are, but usually I figure them out. So.
Yep. And I think it's good just to question things every once in a while, even if you kind of know, but just if you question things, it lets people know you're looking, whoever might be doing that questioning. So, but again, we didn't see anything suspicious. But this is just kind of some background of what we do as part of the audit.
Okay.
I wanted to comment that the audit management letter was extremely helpful.
Good.
And I think we should have that available when we work on the budget. Just for background or pull it out, because it really pulled everything together for me more than it has in the past. Thank you.
You're welcome.
And you had a discussion in there about the retirement program. What kind of retirement program do we have? Is it a government program,
It's
a
called-
401k?
It's called PARA. Yeah,
Okay.
it's a Public Employee Retirement Association.
So it's a defined program? Or
yes.
They don't.
So
contribute?
it's legislated, right, on what percentage we are required as an organization to contribute to our employees, and our employees put in a certain percentage too, but it's involuntary. It's not voluntary. So it's part of, and it's, I don't know if you want to talk a little bit about the PARA audit, how that works, but.
Sure. So you're required to be part of this it's a pension plan for employees where the district contributes 7.5% of the employee salaries and the employees contribute 6.5%. It goes into a fund that's managed by the state. And then-
State board, PIRA board.
Yep, exactly. So then there's, this gets a little, definitely gets technical, but there's actuaries at the state. So they've got the big pool of assets that the state manages. And then they also, the actuaries look at, okay, all of the people that are part of this plan, what are their projected payouts into the future? And they compare the assets to the projected payouts. And right now it's about, I think it's 87% funded. So that 13% unfunded is it's referred to as a net pension liability. And all the participants in the plan have to report their small little share of that liability. And it's based on your contributions into the plan. But that liability doesn't actually have to be paid off. You're
Well,
just
and they
required-
adjust the amounts that the employee and employer
The legislature
contribute
can do
to,
that, yep.
the legislature does to try to get that higher.
Yep, there's a few different tools they have, but right, that's one of them. So you're just required to continue to make those contributions into the plan as you have been doing.
Okay, got it. Thank you. That was kind of a long discussion, and I have figured out that I'm the only person in here who is not a government employee at some point. So that's why I didn't know. Okay, anybody else have any questions?
Nope, I would move that we accept the 2021 annual audit report.
Second? So second. Any further discussion? All in favor, say aye.
Aye.
Opposed, no. Being very careful. Okay, the plan passes. Thank you, Andy. I appreciate you coming and explaining that, because we did have quite a change in that. Okay, that brings us to item 7B, the stormwater prevention plan. This is the first time, by the way, I went back and looked, both of these things are on the same agenda.
Oh, the audit, yeah, usually the audit's in May.
Usually they're
Yeah,
on different months. So.
Yeah.
And we have a public comment period, so we'll open up the public comment period now. Is anybody here to comment on the MS4 document? Thank you. Good to meet you. Nobody here to comment on it? In that case, we'll close the public meeting. Any comments from the board on the document?
I just had a question.
Okay.
I was wondering, of all of the things that we can choose to make priorities, when do the staff choose the priorities and what's the process for choosing?
The priorities for
the stormwater pollution plan report.
Is there a particular MCM or control measure you're referencing?
Yeah, so each of the control measures we're required to complete. So if there's a particular place that you're
the ones that are the issues, when do we choose those?
The issues.
Yeah, so we chose BMPs, de-icing, and storm drain cleaning.
What page of
Those
that?
have, that's question number 2 and 3, MCM1. Those have changed year to year, and that's those priorities come from education staff, so SAGE generally.
Right, so she would say these are the things for this past year that she worked on as for education and outreach purposes. So it would be part of her programming for the year.
Okay.
Sorry, I wasn't following which question you were talking
Well,
about.
and I know we're not gonna do all of them. We're interested
Right.
in all and we
Yeah.
do something on all, but these
Yeah.
are
Mhm.
the things that were chosen. So I was curious about that.
Mhm.
Thanks.
Okay, any other discussion of the MS4? Or, yeah, MS4 annual report?
I'll move that we accept the 2021 MS4 annual report and authorize the district administrator to submit the report to the Minnesota Pollution Control Agency.
And I will second that.
All right, any further discussion? I'd say it was nicely done. Every year it's nicely done. I learned something from
Yeah.
it, so that's good.
A lot of information she collects.
Yeah. So all in favor of the motion, say aye.
Aye.
Opposed? MS4 passes. Thank you all. Moving right on to agenda. Item number 8, attorney report.
Hello, I don't have anything to report this evening unless you have any questions for me.
Okay. Any, just one curious question, sort of backing up to the MS4. We did post it on our website. I found it way down. Do we put the, on any other thing in any print publication or anything?
So it's not a public hearing.
Okay,
It's just an opportunity for the public to comment.
okay,
So we don't publish it
We just
in the same
tell
way
them
as a
what it is.
public hearing. Yeah.
thank you. That was it. Okay, thanks, Lauren. That was a good report. Okay,
A
board.
little long, but
Yeah, a little long. Board issues, the letter from Cliff Eichinger. We got that sent independently. Can you give us some background on this?
Sure. So Cliff emailed it to me and said, I'd like you to share this with Larry and the board and see if they'd be willing to discuss this topic. As I think he wrote in his, I think you said right in the letter that he was feeling a little nostalgia and a little, a little bit of, trying to see what this Battle Creek Golf Course was an important project that actually we started being involved in 2011. We started working with the county on some buffers and wetland restoration work. And Bill, I might have you jump in here too and maybe give some background to the natural resources if you're available on Battle Creek, or the ponds of Battle Creek. Do you want to give a little history of our work with them out there?
Yeah, we've, similar to Keller Golf Course, we had worked with them, with the golf course superintendent on improving a number of wetland buffer areas. That particular piece of property has several high quality wetlands that are unique to the watershed. So we targeted those areas and had a very strong partnership. And probably over the course of 6 years, we were able to restore over 10 acres of no play area on that course and kind of complemented the natural areas and the unique wetlands on that property. So I think that's probably where Cliff is coming from and kind of driving that that idea of his.
Right, so if you're familiar with the history, the facility was closed by Ramsey County last fall, as he says in his letter as well. There's been a lot of talk about what the future might hold on that site, and what Cliff would be proposing would be, us being a partner in purchasing that property for, open space or golf course operation.
How does this fit into our, we have our plan of targeted land that we might want to purchase that's ideal to preserve and help improve and maintain water quality? How does this stand?
I mean,
in
we
that?
don't have a plan for that. That's something that we've talking about wetland restoration. There was some,
what do we do? I guess it was, what do we call it? What program do we have to go out and seek land preserve it or convert it from pervious to impervious, or what is that?
So I mean, we have our targeted retrofit programs. That would be for water quality. That would be doing infiltration or filtration for water quality.
And that's where we've got a map and we have targeted places that are priority areas to try to target. That's what I'm trying to get at is usually we have like, here are our priority areas that we want to target for this, that, and the other thing.
We don't have that for open space preservation. We do for water quality projects and we do for wetland restoration potential. That was something that was done, but not for open space.
Are you thinking of offsetting net loss?
Well, no, what I'm thinking of is I thought that when Marge was president, we put a ton of money into an account, and the goal to do that was to identify projects that we could proactively acquire some land and do. And I guess that's what became the retrofit.
I think the
project.
targeted retrofits, but that'd be like the Target stores and the Maplewood Mall, those kinds of projects.
Right.
Yeah.
But I'm thinking in the goals of that, I think we should be considering proactively the last bits of open space and land that could be preserved if it meets our goals and aligns with what we're trying to accomplish. And so that's why I was thinking we might have some, this might already be rated on how well it would serve as a place to conserve,
I think even in the absence of a plan, it is true that this is a large tract of open space that's undeveloped and we don't have many of these. Cliff says it too in his letter, besides other park and golf course spaces, we don't have property like this in our watershed. There are other watershed districts that do levy for property acquisition for open space preservation. That is something we probably would need to go through a plan amendment, or at least talk through kind of how that meets our goals. We'll make sure we're real clear about how we're using that. We have given money, as Cliff has alluded to in the letter as well, for the Fish Creek open space project. That was a number of years ago. That was a really good discussion amongst the board on whether or not to do that, and it was decided to do that as well. So we do have some precedent for that.
So the question is whether to ask staff to do some more work, right? So maybe we can figure out if the board supports that, and we could all, if we do, then we could submit kind of ideas and questions of things to look at, like how it fits in our plan. I agree with Pam. I think it would be good to look into it further.
I agree. I read it, and you're right. We don't have that many places left that we can preserve. I understand that it's pretty, could be complicated. We don't want to run a golf course, maybe. Although if Brad was here, he'd probably speak up and say, no, it's not really a good idea. But to me, the next step would be, like Diane said, to have a motion from the board to authorize staff and VAR to look into what this would mean, how it fit into our goals, and to start the process of communicating, probably with Maplewood, on whether they would be partners in this, whether we'd carve this out for ourselves, or what would happen to it.
And I would just throw in another idea that since the Ramsey County Correctional Facility is right next to it, and they do that whole growing operation, there might be some cooperation with Ramsey County maybe, and that organization and this land too. That possible.
Although didn't Ramsey County reject this?
Well,
they're the ones that they own it.
Yeah, they own it.
And they closed the golf course and did put it out to market for developers. And at this point, they haven't chosen anyone. I don't know, Bill, do you have anything to add on the relationship between Ramsey County and this property?
Well, I think Ramsey County Corrections would love to have that partnership, but I don't think it seems like the environment right now in the county won't allow that. So, yeah, I think one side would love it and the other side not so much.
Okay, well, I suppose we can
It's
still
contested.
try to tell the temperature.
Yeah.
So
Yep.
Could I, yeah, so I obviously relatively new to this board, but when I read Cliff's email, what concerned me was however in alignment his concerns are with this board, and I think they're actually very much in alignment with the objectives of this board and what we've been asked to do by the two respective counties. What concerned me, and it sounds like the answer is no, does this board or does this institution have a policy, a defined policy on land acquisition, development, and disposal? So that if we're going to become property owners, we go into it with eyes wide open. I am very familiar with both at the state level and at the university, an inordinate temptation to acquire land for really positive, good reasons, and then be stuck with it forever.
Yeah.
In the position where in some cases, particularly if you commit to being open space, this land actually has the potential, perhaps long after we're no longer managers of this board, to be a net deficit to this organization. And I am very concerned that a positive vote of saying, boy, this is a really good idea, in the absence of having a land management policy, is almost putting the cart before the horse. Now, if we can accomplish both at the same time and ask staff and Tina and to look at how other water management districts do this, how both Washington and Ramsey County might be interested in either participating or otherwise at least offering their opinion, my confidence grows a little bit. But I do want to express a serious reservation right now that this is a big, big piece of property. And both counties have an interest in how, again, preservation of open space and water quality is associated with that is very positive. But property tax is a very powerful tool that both counties are interested in. And if we were to acquire this, we're acting in some respects contrary to some of the development goals, certainly of Ramsey County.
And that's one of the things that if they look at it, that really has to be in there, and looking at the other districts, what their policies look like. And one of the ideas I had was maybe we facilitate something, we need to explore that, but we don't end up being the owner. Maybe there's a nonprofit or something else, because we contribute to things sometimes. There's just a whole bunch of questions, but I think it's worth looking at them because it's so rare that there's that kind of
And
property.
it could be something where we end up collaborating and we maintain the ponds and the vegetation around ponds, you know. And I mean, we have purchased land. We own like the giant pipe, the whatever, right?
Outline.
Well, we own the pipe, yeah.
We own a pipe. There's things we own. There is that there is precedent for owning things. So yeah, I really support looking at this and seeing what might be possible, because of course we all like to see it preserved if possible. But I would also say too, if we're just to throw out another piece, a little strip next to Tanner's Lake, there was a piece like Oakdale bought up all of the southeast west side of the lake. And it's been a giant parking lot, you know, they tore down all the buildings, there used to be a couple restaurants there and a glass door, and it's just been a vacant parking lot for, I don't know, 10, 15 years now, and it just would be so nice to consider, like, well, that might be a targeted retrofit, just at least go dig up the parking lot until something does go in there. I'm just want to throw that out there as another piece to consider looking at while you're thinking about this.
And it's a 77-acre parcel now, but St. Paul sold their water utility right away from Anoka County all the way in 100 feet wide. Some of it went to property owners, some of it went to developers, some of it's still sitting there, but it wasn't all sold in one piece. And I don't know enough about the layout of this property to know whether it would be beneficial to the counties to have a smaller piece peeled off for development or something. That's a really big parcel, 70, that's 240s almost. So I think that what I would like to see is it looked at, and you might even want to consider a committee of creative thinkers, pull Cliff in, and if there's somebody on the CAC that's good at this kind of thing, people with some state and nonprofits experience, You know, but a group like the Nature Conservancy might not be interested if there's no contiguous connections, but who knows?
Yeah.
I don't know if the Sam Lassard Fund would pay for anything.
Actually,
There's just a ton
The
of
bird people?
issues. Yeah, Audubon, because they've been so active about the county pieces like the Totem Town, for example. That Friends of the Mississippi, anything connected seem to be interested. I don't know all of
Trying
them,
to brew up partners that might be interested.
and we're always, with all the work we're doing on flooding, is there some storm management area?
Yeah.
Water management.
Or
area?
we need
wetland
there's never
Yeah.
any land within our watershed district to store water, so we always have to, you know, when people come in and they're like, well, there's no place for me to do my mitigation, so I have to do it in Washington County, and that just drives me crazy every time. That could be part of a rationale too. It might be a place where the watershed district could bake some land for, make some of those ponds bigger. I'm just maybe there's something like that go in there.
And bottom line, we need to look at our plan goals, and what ones or multiple ones would it fit? But it's worth looking at because of the rare opportunity. But
There's always GoFundMe, there's a lot of
Careful.
interest in the city. Well, and also, it's another thing too, is would Washington County be interested, because it's right on the border?
yeah, and I think that's what Matt was saying, is that both counties would have an interest in potentially.
So moving forward is what the board, what the board wants to do, I think, is to have staff and our number one, look at a policy that we have for land acquisition and use. And second of all, look into this specific issue to see what are the parameters around it, what opportunities are there, and is there a path moving forward that makes sense for this board? Is that what I'm hearing?
Yep.
Okay, can I have a motion on that so we're clear?
I'd say so moved, I think. what
So
Larry said
moved.
was fine. Yeah.
Thank you. A second?
a second.
Okay, any further discussion on it? Because we're not deciding to buy it, we're deciding to decide if we want to buy it. But if
Well,
we do,
you're-
under what
You're
circumstances?
all you're looking for is the next step of information.
Yeah, is there a path forward? What is it? What kind of creative opportunities do we have with this? And going forward, what's our policy on this? Is that fair?
Yeah, and would our policy need to be amended if we were to acquire property in this
Right.
fashion?
You'd have to have right? We don't not have a land acquisition policy in place.
Right. And
But how did
maybe
we buy land then if we don't have a land
We
acquisition
don't.
policy?
Well, we've built projects. I don't know about like the Allen plant the pipe is different. I think that's not the same.
We bought properties before to avoid flooding.
I think just the Allen plant and this property.
Mhm.
But I think those were bought under, specific purpose, not under a open space or preservation policy.
Well, and it may be too that looking through this thing, you might find Ramsey County is more interested in partnering on this than they are with the whole thing. It's a complicated thing, but I'd
Yeah.
like to see somebody take a look.
I'll have a lot of phone conversations. for sure.
And I like Matt's idea too of looking at the other watershed districts' policies on this, because I know when we toured, it was probably before you guys' time, but there was one southern district we toured, we do summer tours, and we go look at other districts, and they were on a river bluff and they were buying up the land. They had a policy where they were buying land to preserve it in the waterways, and they had,
Riley Purgatory, yeah, that's great. Yeah.
I don't remember where it was, I just remember
Minnehaha
south.
Creek has a policy. There's a couple, there's not a lot, but there's a couple.
Okay, okay, so we have a motion, we have a second. Are we clear on what we want to do?
I think I got good enough direction.
Okay. Anybody from Bar? Okay. All in favor of the motion, say aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Okay, we'll look into it. It's kind of the way it goes.
That's good.
The next item on the agenda is the board action log. I know you wrote something in there. I've been thinking about this and I have a couple of ideas. I actually have a couple of things that I think need to go on the match log. And we can have a discussion about this. This is a parking lot Val actually proposed it, where we park things that we haven't really done yet, but we want to have done at some point. And my suggestion is that we have that action log. Hopefully it's not going to get really big and we can take things off of it if we're no longer interested in them. But that we put it at the end of every agenda so that it's visible to the board members of the things that we want to do but haven't done yet. And I'll give you 3 examples that I thought of that popped into my head that I haven't heard about for quite a while. One is reviewing alum safety and alternatives. We said we were going to do that.
Yeah, we are, so we're, well, that's part of
I'm
the.
actually looking at dissolved aluminum concentrations now and fretting about it. You read my mind.
So that is, the alternatives pieces, that's the aeration study and the spent lime study, so there, so we are doing the alternatives side of things. Yeah.
Right, but we said we come back to the
Yep.
board and we'd have a discussion
Yep.
on it on the board. We haven't done that yet. The other one is PFOAs
Yep.
and the RMWD, which we talked about doing, just haven't done yet. And it's not being critical, it's just those are things that are on our list. The other thing that we had a long time ago, we talked about it in your review, but that we probably want to keep up there is, do we need a more layered organizational structure or not? And it's just something that's there that I'm not judging it right now. It's just something that's there that we want to keep in mind, that we want to keep looking at until something is done on. Or we look at this thing and say, we don't care about that. And again, I would like to see that. My proposal is to put it at the end of the agenda so that we keep this visible to us every single month.
On the agenda or in the packet, at the end of the
We can
packet?
put it right at
Okay.
the end of the packet would be
Okay.
fine. So some place where it's visible to us, so we don't have to go looking for it every
Sure.
time. We can, when we get done with the meetings, I don't know about you guys, but sometimes I go home and say, gee whiz, I wish I would have said something more about that. We put that on at the next meeting and just kind of follow up on it. So any discussion about that?
I just think it'd be helpful to have it in the packet. And then we can save some questions and can see how it's kind of spaced out.
Right. Right. Okay. Well, that takes care of that. Thank you. New reports and presentations. Okay, watershed management plan wetlands update.
Aaron's gonna lead the way on that.
Okay.
Okay, just gonna pull up the memo here. So I asked Tina how she wanted to go through this one. Oh, here we go. Okay. And she mentioned that I should maybe just walk through the memo. It's this is the first task in the watershed management plan wetlands update evaluation project that you saw the scope summary for last month. So the first task is just to go through and assess what we have already in the plan. So this effort involved going back through the plan document and the strategic overview and looking up everywhere that we're talking about wetlands and documenting what we say, what terms we're using, and what the intent of those terms was at the time. So actually I was leveraging a couple of our different staff members at BAR, including Greg Williams, who was involved in the writing of your past plans. So this was a nice person to use because he put these words down in the first place. So it was good for him to go back and summarize those for us. I think I just will start with the summary. The biggest picture look at this is just this very last page where basically in summary, the district's wetland management roles are described in the plan and listed in the policies of Rule E. And the roles generally fall into 2 different categories. So this is the overall summary of what this memo has in it. And one is protecting the quantity, quality, and biological diversity of wetlands by regulation of development activity. So that's one big piece here. And the second is increasing the quantity, quality, and biological diversity of wetlands via restoration projects. And then going further, the quality and biological diversity of wetlands are generally quantified using the MinRam or the district classification. We've talked about that in detail in the recent past. And the MinRam and district wetland classifications are based on functions and values assessments that consider multiple functions of wetlands. So that's the executive summary of the technical memo. The rest of it is just walking through. Oh, no, I just blasted right past it. Stay with me for a moment. Okay. Walking through all these different sections and describing how we're talking about wetlands and wetland management in the district. So I guess before I walk us through the memo, do any of you have any questions or comments just from the get-go that we want to make sure to talk through? I don't have a formal presentation for you today. Just I'm here to talk it through with you.
I just request that you share your screen as you're talking because I'm very visual.
Okay, sure. Happy to do that. What I have up in front of me is just what's in the board packet. It's just the memo, so I'll do that. Any other initial
Well, yeah, you did a nice job. I've been through the plan too and pulled all this stuff out, and your stuff looks a lot like what I came up with. It's sort of all over the place and really isn't integrated. And that's the reason why we're talking about this, is to try to get it integrated. I'll just say, and I'll wait and see what you have to say about it. But some of the terms aren't as precise as I would like to understand them, at least. So I'll wait to see what you say about them, or we can. I don't want to prolong the evening, but because I can ask them offline if I need to.
Sure.
I would like it not only be clear to us, but clear to anybody who looks at this as to how we're managing wetlands. Particularly, and I made a note, and this goes from 5 years ago when I brought it up, is that I understand in the workshop that we had, there is no regulation about flooding wetlands. But we routinely, like when we just talked about the one in Ramsey County, it's a place for flood storage. What kind of regulation, or not regulation, what kind of policy do we have when we flood wetlands? I understand the whole thing about clean water going in and all that sort of stuff, but what happens when we put water in wetlands? Do we have a policy about getting it out?
Do we, but we don't flood wetlands. Like the district doesn't flood wetlands.
Well, sometimes we do. Sometimes our policy is I can tell you for sure, because wetland A is sitting right there. And the deal is if Snail Lake floods, it comes right into wetland A.
Well, that's its natural path though. It has to have an overflow, right? So it
isn't its natural path. Its natural path was through Crestview.
This is
Changed it
right.
so it went
so that it wouldn't, right? So I would say we don't intentionally flood wetlands for the sake of flooding them. We might redirect flow for flood risk purposes.
And some of the beltline options we were looking at was to allow some water into some of the wetlands downstream even.
And it also,
for the beltline?
Yeah, for the flood
control. For the resiliency study.
And it also came up at the MOD meeting where they had a proposal. I don't think it ever went anywhere, but they had a proposal where up north they wanted to, the DNR wasn't letting them flood wetlands and they wanted to flood it. And it was like, oh, it's really okay because they're wet. It's not okay. It changes the biodiversity and all the rest of the stuff.
I
So I just want that thought through. I'm not arguing at this point.
Yeah.
I'm just saying that's the kind of thought process I want to go through.
I think that, again, that's where the terminology comes into play though, where the purpose and why decisions are made to direct water in one direction or another is different than that we purposefully flood wetlands like that's.
Sorry,
That's okay.
I didn't mean that. What I meant was that and that's one of the one of the functions they talk about
Right.
is flood storage. I get
Right.
that.
Yeah.
But if we're putting it in for some reason from storm sewers or redirecting things or things like that, what's our policy for getting it back out and restoring it to the way it used to be? That's
Yeah, that's definitely something we'll need to talk through, because I think
right.
it's definitely not as simple as that, right? It's complicated, so.
Well, that's why we have
I think
this
it's
thing that goes on
important.
through November. So
Right.
we're working on it.
Yeah.
Right. And actually, I will say, this memo is only this first step. So this first step is just looking at what do we say right now?
Right.
And the next step is looking at what other people say in their plans. So looking to other watershed districts and watershed management organizations and how they talk about wetlands and how they manage them is the next step. So, and then after that, we'll be talking about whether we want to make changes or, how we feel about that difference. So.
And Aaron, that's a good segue to my comment. I remember when that was laid out and we had the tasks and everything, but then when I looked at this, I couldn't remember what the next one was.
Yeah.
What the schedule was. So I think instead of having to go back and look it up, it would be good to attach it.
Sure.
This is step 1 and step 2 was going to be done for this, but I just, attach that relevant little piece of the rest of the project and that.
Sure. So the other thing, actually, okay, I was gonna reference you to that project tracking spreadsheet that's part of the story map, but that doesn't give you the actual task breakouts. So I think we could, as part of the project status report, mention the next steps. Yeah.
Yeah. So I
Sure.
just, there were several times in this packet where it would have been helpful to just not have to go back and look up stuff. So.
Sure.
Now, I don't want it to be a 5-inch packet either, but that wasn't a piece, if I remember correctly.
Sure. Right. So just so that we're all clear, the next step, which is currently written to be at the August meeting, is to review other Twin Cities metro area WMO watershed management organization, wetland policies, rules, implementation items, and definitions. So that's the next task that you'll be hearing about in August.
Right.
So with that, oh, now I moved something on my screen. Are you still seeing the,
Yeah,
Yep.
We see the back, it says background, and we can see your cursor.
okay. So you see the documentation of wetland management in the 2017 RWMWD Watershed Management Plan memo?
yes.
Okay. All right. So moving on. The places in the plan, the big, thick, heavy plan that Matt, I'm sure you have poured over and have memorized by heart by now. The places in the plan where wetlands appear in the following section. So it's in the plan goals. And if you remember, our plan is a little bit different than some of the other ones you may have seen elsewhere in that we created a document called the strategic overview where the goals and signs of success and other information supporting the discussion of goals is in this front section called the strategic overview. And so we definitely talk about wetlands there in the priorities, action items, and signs of success sections of that portion of the plan. And then in section 1, which is the district-wide inventory of the main body of the plan, there's definitely mention of wetlands and wetland management, and in particular section 1.11. The district's roles and responsibilities are described in detail in section 3, and then district programs and implementation activities are in section 4. And then there's definitely a lot of rules, as you know, around wetlands when redevelopment starts to happen. That's the district rule E. And then lastly, we talk about the definition of some wetland related terms. And we don't have a glossary in the plan. So to Larry's point, that might be something to think about going forward, but we have provided some description of what the intention of these definitions was in the past based on other documents and guidance that we were utilizing to help guide the use of those words. So that is included in the memo as well.
We do have a glossary in our rules, so some of these might come.
Okay, right. Yeah. So when we talk about the plan goals, none of the 6 goals specifically addresses wetlands only, but they come up in a couple of these goals, and I've listed them here. So the first goal is achieve quality surface water. So that's where we say we want to maintain or improve surface water quality to support healthy ecosystems and provide the public with a wide range of water-based benefits. And I'll talk to you later about how some of the implementation items that we have in the current version of the plan reflect that goal. The second is healthy ecosystems. So wetland discussions come up a lot when we're talking about ecosystems in this plan. So with the second goal, we say we want to manage water and related natural resources to create and preserve healthy ecosystems. So again, when we talk about healthy ecosystems, we're often including mention of wetlands. I'm trying to stop short of just reading you this memo. So I don't want to just do an audiobook for you here. I'm trying to pick out the most salient points here. So we'll keep going here. In terms of the strategic overview, priorities, action items, and signs of success, we don't specifically reference wetlands, but we talk about partnering to perform ecological restoration, which could include the restoration of wetlands. And also there's action item EC3, which is to lead ecological restoration projects to improve water resources and upland habitat. The specific action item that mentions wetlands is this EC1, which is to implement the district's wetland permitting program. And that is because the Ramsey-Washington Metro Watershed District is the local governmental unit, so the LGU, for administering WACA. And that's true of all areas in the district except the city of St. Paul. They are the LGU for wetland topics that come up within their domain, even within the boundaries of the Watershed District. In terms of signs of success, how we decide whether we are successfully implementing our plan, we said that in terms of specifically referencing wetlands, we said that a sign of success would be that the quantity of ecologically diverse aquatic, wetland, and associated upland habitats is increased, and that wetlands are preserved and protected as measured by their net area, so no net loss, and the continued viability of their functions and value. In terms of the inventory, we talk quite a bit about the differences between wetlands and lakes because we do manage them differently. And so there's some technical information on how they are classified. And an acknowledgement that there are some wetlands throughout the district that we call lakes that are not actually lakes. So things like Casey Lake, Grass Lake, Pig's Eye Lake, these are actually wetlands by their technical classification. And so the district might pursue some activities in those water bodies, but it would be on a case-by-case basis and always to achieve district goals as they're stated in the plan. There's more information about WACA. There's information about the wetland classification system. And the district classification system is based on these MinRam categories. And this is something that we've talked about in some past board packets, so I won't rehash this here. Matt, for your information, I don't remember which month it was, but within the relatively recent past, we put a lot of information in about the MinRam classifications throughout the district and what that means, how that classification system works. So we can let you know what month that was. It was in a fairly recent board packet. So depending on what classification a certain wetland has in the district, there are different treatment requirements when development comes into play. And so that's listed here. So I won't go into a lot of detail with this. It's all pretty well laid out in this memo, but we can always get back into more detail about that later if you would like. So now we're into the roles and responsibilities section. And in the plan as it's currently written, there's a lot of information in there about the district's role as administering the LGU responsible for administrating the Wetland Conservation Act. So that has some very specific requirements. And so section 3 really mostly, well, I guess really only is talking about that role in protecting wetlands, because that is the major program that people are employing to protect wetlands when development is coming into play. And then in terms of plan programs and implementation actions, this is in section 4. Again, we talk about the district's role as the LGU in administering WACA. And there's a little narrative section here that goes into a little more definition on what that means in the context of development. So this is like buffer rules and other no net loss kinds of rules. And then in terms of the implementation plan, so there's a section of every watershed plan that's written in the state of Minnesota that's about implementation, and it gets very specific about specific action items. And what tends to happen in my experience in helping to write plans for you and other watershed districts is they tend to be really specific in the short term, and then they get more general as you go. So the specific ones that we were able to pull out of this plan that relate to wetlands, I think are basically done. So these are things that were indicated to happen within the first couple of years of the plan being published. And I think to large degree, these are done. And as I mentioned before, these are activities that were slated to happen in wetlands, but these were done for water quality purposes, really related to downstream lakes. So when we look at managing macrophytes in the Casey Lake wetland, that was really mostly done because of the downstream impacts that Casey Lake has on other lakes in the watershed district. Likewise, the carp stuff that you see here in the Lake Owasso Central Park wetlands. Carp management is done because carp really help wetlands and ponds and lakes internally load, and that water goes downstream where it affects water bodies downstream. And then the other one mentioned here is this LO3, performing a feasibility study of retrofit opportunities throughout the Lake Owasso subwatershed to improve water quality. We were looking at tributary wetland systems because we knew that those wetlands were contributing to higher phosphorus loads to Lake Owasso. So this is not unlike some of the pond work that we're doing elsewhere in the district right now. And you saw a couple of scope summaries for some projects like that elsewhere in the packet. So we had some specific wetland implementation items in the current plan that are pretty much wrapped up, and they were about water quality. There are more general action items though that are district wide, and those relate more to seeking out restoration opportunities in terms of bringing water back to areas that were formerly drained, and looking at improving ecosystems throughout the watershed district.
Which kind of brings up a comment too. And I looked at that list and was pretty sure we've done everything. Okay, so we have a 10-year plan. Does that mean we're done doing everything? Or
No, I mean, right, that's a good question. There are quite a number of more general implementation items that are indicated as district-wide. So these were just specific action items that we knew we wanted to do in specific subwatersheds. And I just mentioned them here because I think they're good indications of the types of wetland projects that we have done in the past. But there are, as I said, district-wide implementation items that relate more to things that are mentioned in the strategic overview. So that it's described more generally, so that means we can still pursue them, but they're not laid out specifically subwatershed by subwatershed. Does that make sense? Was that a yes? I couldn't.
Yes, he said yes.
Okay. Okay. I thought you were still thinking. Okay. I'm not going to read through wetland rule E. I think you probably have seen this in action before. If you have questions, Nicole's on the line. I'm here. We can talk about that. But that really comes into play when development is happening and it's adjacent to or even infringing upon a wetland. So lots of information here. This is laid out in the Rule E language. And then the last section of the memo is just terms and definitions. So again, they're not consistently defined in context, but the intended definitions are summarized in the memo here. So we talk a lot about functions and values, and that actually is not as general a term as it sounds. It's actually based very specifically on MNREM and district wetland classification. So the wetland functions and values include things like this bullet list here. So when we say functions and values, this is what we intended the last time the plan was written. And then there's other terms that we use quite often, and these are the definitions that were assumed for the last plan. So we talk about no net loss. That's a WACA That's a WACA term, referencing the program's goal to avoid impacts to the quantity, quality, or biological diversity of wetlands. And if losses are unavoidable, to replace affected wetlands. I won't read through all the rest of these, but this outlines what the current definitions were based on in the existing plan. So I know that was a whirlwind, but I wanted to get this in front of you, get some feedback, especially if this sparks some ideas of things you want us to look for as we're looking at other people's definitions and plans and policies. I mean, we have some ideas based on past discussions with you all, but if there are specific things that you want us to take with us into the second task, that would be really helpful to hear. But also, if you have any questions or other comments, I'd be happy to hear them at this time.
Yeah, again, my comment is you've done a nice job of pulling this stuff out. I went through, I have my book with all kinds of tabs and you can't even see the thing. So you've done a nice job pulling it together. I think we're at a good place in the process. There are some of these terms that I would like further definition. I'm okay with waiting until we find out what other people have so that we have more of a context to work with. So I'm pretty happy with where we are right now in the process. We'll come back in August and talk about the updated information that you have. So I think I have a bunch of things that I have specific questions on, but as part of the process, I'd rather wait and see.
Sure.
And Aaron, looking over the functions and values, as you pull these other policies, it might be interesting to see which ones of this list are articulated in those policies, because I bet we will see some of those. And if these are the functions and values that drove what we said throughout the plan, let's see how some of those translate into policies.
Yeah, I think when we had our, in fact, the information you were talking about for Matt was at our workshop. So we pulled that together.
For the MinRam stuff?
Yeah, the MinRams. And again, I know we've been through this. We went through a lot of it with Victoria Shores, where we looked at who was in charge of what kind of information they had. It's somewhat, when you get people like on the Victoria Shores thing, it's kind of disappointing when you find out you think you're being protected and everybody points the finger at everybody else. So that's one of the reasons I want to talk about this, is that I want to see a little more precision on the divisions, or the district's definitions of some of these things, but it also may be an opportunity to lead on some of these items too. So I think this is a good next step.
Okay. Great. Any other questions, concerns, comments? Nicole, feel free to jump in and add anything. I don't want to put you on the spot, but this is your domain too.
Yeah, no, I don't have anything to add. I think it's a really good summary. I do know that, this might not be within the same time scale, but Capital Region and Ramsey-Washington are looking at starting or look at our rules again for potential changes. So, I'll certainly go over Rule E again and see if there's any points of clarification or anything that we could propose to change. But there's also opportunities to change the rules down the line as well. So it doesn't necessarily have to be on the same schedule as this plan update.
Okay, any other discussion on this? We're on a schedule. You've given us the schedule the last time, so thank you. Move on to the next item.
All right.
Thanks, Erin.
The Owasso Basin feasibility study.
And Sam is here from BAR to present on that. I think you're going to share, go ahead and share your screen, Sam, if you. We can see it.
Let's try this again. I think I put the wrong one on. One more time. All right. Can you see that?
Yes, we can see that.
All right. Perfect. Okay, yeah, here tonight to talk to you this evening about Owasso Basin and North Star Estates and the ongoing flood risk reduction efforts in this area. It's pretty exciting. We're seeing some very tangible results from the fruits of our labor, and it's a happy update to share, and we're excited to hear how the board wants us to move forward. So I'll step right into it here. I'll step through the background and the history just to, bring a few folks up to speed on how we got to where we're at today. I'll highlight the recent work that we've completed in terms of construction projects being recently wrapped up. We'll step through the ongoing analyses we're performing and the flood risk guidance for manufactured homes that we researched and obtained from FEMA. We'll share feedback. We'll share an update on our overall findings, and then we'll share feedback that we received from stakeholders to this project, and which provide the basis for our recommended approach moving forward. So we'll share that recommendation with the board here this evening, and then we have the request for the board to make the decision to aid our team in defining the target level of flood risk or our design criteria that we want to use as the basis for future design and analysis for North Star Estates manufactured homes there around Owasso Basin, and open discussion here at the end. So where we came from, back in 2000, I want to say 18, a resiliency study was performed on the Beltline system looking at the sub-watershed for the large tunnel that drains to the Mississippi River. That study identified the Jarvis Creek sub-watershed upstream of Jarvis Lake in Little Canada as having the highest volume of at-risk homes and businesses at risk of flooding in a 96-hour, 100-year storm event. This is a significant number, higher than any other area of structure counts from that study. So that triggered in 2020 the Owasso Basin Bypass Pipeline Feasibility Study, where we looked at this area in particular to identify the level of effort or the scope of a project necessary to mitigate the flood risk for those homes identified. And that study did identify, we looked at different alternatives, a number of options on what it would or could take to reduce that flood risk. And we noticed a lot of synergies across those, in that those major projects all had similar components that were required to support that larger scale project. And the order of magnitude that came of the projects recommended or identified to be needed from that study, their size were quite significant. And there was a lot of questions or ambiguity regarding some of the structures and the volume of them and the limitations of the study. And that 2020 feasibility study, it also included a recommendation to implement near-term projects, those synergies across the larger scale projects that could be more readily completed. And that was distributed across a 3-phase approach. So phases 1, 2, and 3. And so stepping through those, phases 1 and 2 are now complete. That included construction in and around the Owasso Basin area, focusing on raising Ryan Drive upgrading the hydraulic structure beneath that roadway to increase its capacity. Maintenance along Jarvis Creek, dredging that corridor, work in and around Owasso Basin, and also Keller Parkway, upsizing that drainage culvert to reduce flood risk. There was a significant or a substantial reduction in flood risk for homes and businesses because of these phases 1 and 2. The figure here on the right is an illustration that highlights the structures approximately, the location of structures that have now been removed from the floodplain as a result of the completed work. Those are highlighted in green. On the bottom left of the slide there, you'll see a zoomed in view of the homes just upstream of Keller Parkway. So that orange border was the previous 100-year inundation extent. As a result of these projects, we now have that highlighted or that blue hatched inundation extent, which is much less. And we have 4 homes now outside of that floodplain, which is fantastic. And then phase 3, which is the third and final phase of those 3 phased near-term projects that came out of the 2020 study, is ongoing. And that has a focus on Owasso Basin and North Star Estates. And that's what we're here to talk tonight more about, so we can understand how the board would like us to continue moving forward. So talking about the ongoing analyses and the flood risk guidance to help inform our analyses or decisions. Prior studies completed a macro assessment of the 100-year flood inundation extent in North Star Estates, and that included a number of limitations. For one, we were utilizing LIDAR data, publicly available LIDAR data, to understand existing grade and topography around the area. That's not as accurate as in-field survey. So, we have seen variances of up to 6 inches to a foot, which can be substantial and significant in terms of flood risk. Construction methodology of the manufactured homes in North Star Estates is significantly different than that of a conventional or single family dwelling. And the methodology utilized to count structures within a floodplain in North Star Estates was limited to the inundation extent being mapped along a contour line that corresponded with that 100-year water surface elevation. And wherever that contour intersected a building footprint, that structure was counted and considered at risk in those prior studies. And so the limitation to that is the water level could be 1 inch deep at a corner of the building, but with the nature of how the count was performed, it would consider that at risk of flooding. So with the large scale projects necessary to reduce flood risk, and then some ambiguity in and around North Star Estates and the high volume of structures identified at risk, we're performing a micro assessment in the area to better understand the current level of flood risk, current level of flood risk for these homes in the area. And so taking a look at manufactured homes and their construction methodology, there are industry recommended best practices and government codes and ordinances that need to be required or need to be followed during the installation or placement of these structures. In essence, the elevated structure rests on a foundation support system, and it's providing needed clearance between existing grade and the underside of the building for utility terminal connections. It's important to note that many of the homes in North Star Estates have been here for many years and may predate some of the current or adopted government codes and ordinances. And so there aren't specific dimensions or clearance zones, that we have high confidence in. That's what each of these homes have been constructed to. So understanding that is important. And then we performed a verification survey partnering with the City of Little Canada to ground truth or verify low entry to a small sample size of homes in North Star Estates, limited to about 10 structures. And the intent there was to perform a field survey to cross-reference at-grade elevations to the LiDAR data, and then survey the physically observed or visually identified low entry point into these homes, both to verify that the structures are elevated and then what that elevation is relative to existing grade. We were also hoping to survey the utility terminal connection elevations, but the survey crew wasn't able to because of obstructions. The skirting that was around these buildings was in place and they couldn't get through it. So we weren't able to accomplish that, but let me go back. And a reason this verification survey was so important to us was because when you consider flood risk reduction or the risk of flooding in a standard or single family dwelling, that low entry point is typically near or at grade, tied to the threshold of the door or a window well, and so forth. Well, with an elevated home, it's a different perspective. It's a different level of flood water required before that home becomes inundated. And you can't necessarily reference existing grade or wet ground as your flood point. And so since this is a little different in there, we wanted to understand if there was guidance out there or available to us. So we looked to government published documentation for guidance, and that led us to FEMA and this FEMA P85 document, which has a figure of the cover here on your screen. And a lot of very useful information in this document. Provides a lot of guidance that we can reference or look toward to help us better understand how we want to approach North Star Estates and evaluating flood risk. Because our ultimate goal is to understand what is our target flood level that we want to design our projects to, and whether we're at grade or up to the underside of the support chassis system, there is a very significant different type of project needed. So looking to FEMA, they have a minimum and a recommended BFE, which is a base flood elevation. That's the equivalent of the 100-year flood elevation. So the BFE equals 100-year flood elevation. The minimum is essentially that low entry into the finished floor space of the home, but the recommended best practice is just to the underside of the chassis or the support structure as the best practice to utilize. There's also guidance in the FEMA document with regard to utilities. There's language in there that stipulate or recommend that utilities be elevated up above the BFE or made watertight to it, so that there's no risk of utilities becoming compromised during a flood event. There's a lot of language and requirements in there that speak to foundations and anchoring methodology, and is with the performance requirement that all these structures and their foundations are designed for flood resistant considerations. And a significant caveat to keep in mind with regard to utilities and foundations is that given our uncertainty regarding the age or condition of some of these support structures and utility connections, we're not sure as to their integrity. And so that will be an outstanding question for sure. So something to keep in mind. A couple excerpts from that FEMA report, just I guess the verbiage that I summarized in the prior slide. So it speaks to the BFE elevation, some foundation and anchoring and utilities there. So gathering that information together and ground truthing or evaluating the field survey, that data we collected, and then looking at our flood elevation relative to the low entry of these homes, we uncovered that most homes in North Star Estates are not actually at risk of flooding in their home or in the finished floor space during a 100-year design storm event. So while that's great news we also want to keep in mind that flood risk does still remain from other perspectives. An example here is the home may be high and dry, but you may have 3 feet of water just outside your front door. And that's a significant risk, especially if there's families and so forth. And also how, in the event of an emergency, would rescue personnel carry out their duty. So a couple other considerations to keep in mind with the constructed nature of manufactured homes is you have different thresholds to evaluate flood risk against, or you could. Wet ground, of course, is just saturated ground. Then you hit levels of safety hazards. And we look to FEMA and other similar disaster response government agencies for the guidelines to reference or to develop this figure. And what we found was that in water depths above 6 inches, that's when these agencies felt that the risk, there's significant hazards with walking through that depth of water level. You can't see obstructions or could be holes. And then above 6 to 12 inches, or anything above 12 inches, was where they felt there was a significant or an elevated risk of driving a vehicle. So under 12, you could drive a vehicle. Under 6, you could walk. And then we have the utilities and the wet floors shown there as well for consideration. So pulling all this together and trying to understand that most homes are not actually at risk of flooding in the home, which is how we would view a conventional or typical single family dwelling. There's these other elements of flood risk that we want to keep in mind and consider. So from here, we met with the City of Little Canada and district staff to discuss. And from that, collaborating and working through our findings and analyses and so forth, this 3-bullet summary is, I guess, the takeaway of their feedback and the group's recommendation for the board to consider moving forward in continuing the evaluation of flood risk in North Star Estates. So the recommendation would be to design to a target 100-year water surface elevation that is consistent with the FEMA recommended BFE. That's the highlighted or circled in red there. And then while we meet that metric, also confirm that emergency response personnel vehicle access is maintained and provided to impacted homes. So that would mean our access roadways up and through these areas to these homes would need to have a water level depth of less than or equal to 12 inches. So a performance criteria of the flood risk reduction effort with the target 100-year water surface elevation to that FEMA recommended BFE. And then the continuation of evaluating emergency response plans for the homes within that 100-year floodplain. So stepping through what this all looks like to illustrate or help visualize the extent of the effect. Here on the screen is a 96-hour 100-year storm event inundation map pre-2020-21. So this is prior to the phase 1 and phase 2 projects being completed. This is the 100-year inundation extent that we were evaluating against in that 2020 study. So a significant number of homes impacted, as you can see, high volume, high count. So stepping through to current condition, which is the completion of the phase 1 and phase 2 projects that we talked about earlier, a substantial reduction in the water surface elevation with a number of structures coming out of that floodplain. And then if we transition to one more slide here, this inundation extent is representing the recommended level of flood risk, or that proposed inundation extent that came from the stakeholder discussion. So all homes would essentially be flood free, with the caveat of one home that is exceptionally low compared to the others being taken out of the floodplain with noting that several of the roads in and around North Star Estates will need to be elevated to maintain that emergency access. So summarizing the figure here again. So the inundation extent shown here is showing the recommended approach for the targeted 100-year water surface elevation to that FEMA recommended BFE base flood elevation. And that would require a regional solution to lower the current 100-year by about 5 inches. And we don't have that fully vetted out. And so we don't know what that solution looks like to accomplish that. We're just trying to understand what we want, what we need to design to, what our target is here. And then if that is the adopted approach by the board moving forward for evaluating flood risk here in North Star Estates, portions of the access roads would need to be raised to maintain emergency vehicle access, because currently there's 9 to 10 homes that the access roadway is too deep and emergency personnel may turn away if they came upon them. And then that single home there shown in solid red would require a singular approach to address to take that out of the floodplain, whether that's a buyout, a replacement, a new structure going into elevated up higher, because that the low entry was substantially low. It was very near existing grade. So with that, and in closing, the request here for the board is what feedback may you have and the direction, if you can provide on how you'd like the team to proceed. The question is, does the board support and want to adopt the stakeholder recommended approach for setting the target level of flood risk for those homes in North Star Estates? Perhaps there's other factors that the board would like us to keep in mind or consider. A possible example would be, while emergency personnel vehicle access is maintained, do we want to also keep in mind that we need to have a walkway to the house where the water is not exceptionally deep and so forth. And then we also have figures available here in the following slides, if we have time or if there's interest to step through them, that illustrate the 10, 25, and 50-year inundation extents. So.
Thanks, Sam. I have a question for you. So could you remind us again, who were the stakeholders who were reviewing and making recommendations?
So we met with the City of Little Canada. So Bill Dirks and Chris Heineman, the city administrator and the Public Works director, and then Tina from the district, and then bar staff, Brad, Aaron, myself, Brandon, stepping through that discussion.
And the city had been talking to their emergency response staff as well to inform some of the information that you saw.
Do we have an estimate or a feeling, now that we've cleaned out Jarvis Creek and made some other improvements, about dwell time for this? In other words, when the water comes up, does it go down a lot faster than it did before? Is that part of the modeling? So instead of talking about 5 days or 10 days, we're talking about 1 day.
Yeah, that's a good question.
That is a good question.
That is, and we tried getting that in time for the meeting, Larry, but we just weren't able to pull it off. So it's a question we had too, right at the 11th hour, that we thought would be great to have an answer for. So we don't have it at the moment, but we can get it for you because we're curious about that too.
It kind of makes a difference, whether we should invest in these things. And I would like to see at least the 50-year, but I don't want to drag this out. So I'm wondering if we should do continue it for the answer to that other question, or what we should do.
So here's the 50-year.
Okay, so that's not so bad either.
So the 50-year looks pretty good, except for that one. Just out of curiosity's sake, I know I've been over there, but I can't conceptualize that house. Why is it so low? Is it in a dip or was it just built low?
In that northwest corner, Larry?
Yeah, the ones in red all the time, forever.
Yeah, and see, we don't have a great understanding as to the installation or construction timeline on many of these homes. And if you look at current ordinances and codes, that is much lower. It probably should not have been constructed or allowed to have been constructed to that. But this is a pretty old manufactured home park and may predate the adaptation of current codes. So hard to know exactly what the driver was for being so low, but it is exceptionally low.
You said the home itself is not raised, right? The entry is right at ground level.
It's very close. It is raised a little bit, Tina, but it's not to the level. It's not like that 24 inches that the other homes are at.
And a question I have with the 50 is if we went with that instead, how would that change the recommendations?
So the 50-year inundation here on the screen, the top left and the bottom right, there's homes that these are the problem areas in the 100-year. The bottom right gets better, and then the top left, you still have 3 homes where the water level across the roadway is exceeding that 12-inch minimum for vehicle access. So those 3 homes at the corner there wouldn't have vehicle access if you follow that, which would require some sort of nominal or localized road raise to mitigate.
And if we went with the emergency vehicle access, that still means that people in some emergency responders would potentially be walking through water that's 12 inches deep, although the temporal nature of the flooding is obviously where that comes in, where that question comes in.
Which we don't know.
What, and again, just ask some questions so I can understand moving forward. Do they have electrical hookups, central electrical hookups? But what do they use? Do they have gas that they supply themselves? Or is it centrally supplied? You know?
So the
It's okay. It's a reasonable answer. I'm just wondering what kind of hazard exists if the water does come up, even if we raise the ways and things like that, there's still going to be water under. My main question, which I take it you didn't have time to get the answer. My main question is how fast will this drain? Now that we and the Keller weirs in place so that we're prepared for these kind of things. We've cleaned out Jarvis Creek. We've made all kinds of improvements that it's remarkable when you look at it. But it's sort of like we've gotten up to the 90% level. How much do we want to invest in the other 10%?
Well, and that's certainly something that we can look at in terms of the duration and then getting a better sense of the utilities. But it's true that when we look at other homes, more conventionally built homes, we don't typically factor in the timing nature of a flood event. We do in an emergency response plan. You know, if we're not going to build, if we're not going to do any other infrastructure in a regional sense to affect that flood level, then we do look at how flashy it is, because that dictates how reasonable it might be to do something like sandbags or whatnot. But in terms of deciding whether or not to do a regional project, we don't typically, and Tina, you should jump in if I'm forgetting a time that we have, but we don't typically talk about how flashy or not the flood level is in making that first decision. Does that sound right to you, Tina?
Yeah, and the length of inundation, we wouldn't normally, I think on a case by case. Well, I'm thinking about other instances where we would consider emergency access too. I don't know that that's besides the Weir Drive. You know, maybe that's the only other situation we've been faced with where they wouldn't have another way in.
And this is where it's a unique
Yeah.
situation for us, right? Because usually if we're looking at a home that's at risk of flooding, usually those entry points are right at grade or close, you know, right at grade. So if we're worried about emergency access, we're
Right.
typically really worried about the home because water is pouring into the home at that point. So it's just a little different.
Yeah, I
way to
think
look at
I think it is important to understand the inundation extents or the length of time.
And so hot off the press, I just got a note, approximately 2 days
2 days.
for the 100-year to get drawn back down to the normal water level. So the normal is these homes aren't flooded anymore. Even at the 10-year, none of these homes are really impacted. So that's to get it back down to baseline. So there's going to be a point here from the 100 level down to where, you know, all the, maybe it's the 25-year isn't going to be that long. But to go from 100-year down to normal is approximately 2 days.
One other thing I'm thinking of is, you know, with global warming, we get fewer storms and the storms are more extreme. So therefore our 100-year event might become a 10-year event in this year. And so just keeping that in mind, I mean, that's where the trend is going. So when you're thinking like, well, let's look at the 50-year event, but in reality, the 50-year event might really be a 5-year event.
But if the drawdown is 5 hours, then it's all a risk assessment. Where I'm struggling a little, but first I have to say I love it that we finally got all the FEMA information. That's something that's just been kind of a huge gap, and it was really helpful. And then I was thinking about the process. We had all these feasibility studies for each section. And as we went through them, there were all kinds of great ideas about how we could reduce the flooding and connect pipes, you know, east and all kinds of other things. And it became clear that if we looked at some of these, what we were calling the low-hanging fruit, like raising Ryan Drive, we could do them now and not have to wait for a longer plan. And so it was very exciting to see that. I think we got more bang for our buck than I expected. But what I'm missing is, were there other pieces of low-hanging fruit that we could do that would improve this? We just kind of picked from a whole bunch of options, and I didn't have time to go back and look at the feasibility studies. Which are there some other things that aren't super expensive and easy that would then get us the 100-year piece that we would want?
To get to the 100-year, Diane, is going to be a challenge with, call it a low-hanging fruit type of project. But yes, there are other features in and around Owasso Basin that we are looking to include in phase 3 that are readily constructible, you know, lower cost, while, because these phase 1 and phase 2 projects and what we intend to include in phase 3, they're also providing that infrastructure to support a future large scale project if needed. And that includes, you know, diversion pipelines, berms, some pond expansion and so forth. So there are options, but we're running out of them, I guess is a good way to put it. And they don't have the impact that we would hope for all by themselves.
The fruit are getting a little bit higher.
And that's what I wondered, because I couldn't remember, you know, I remember some of the bigger cost items and that would make a huge difference, but they were bigger and I just couldn't remember from the things we chose. Much left.
I think the question on the table for today helps to define how far we'll need to go, because the question for today is, are we looking at this flood risk correctly? Are we, you know, by looking at that, you know, allowing the flooding to that base floor elevation, but also looking at emergency vehicle access, is that the right approach? And should that drive how far up the fruit vine we're reaching for projects? Because if we were trying to keep everything dry, which we've walked through why we don't think that the ground needs to be dry everywhere because of the elevated entry points, you know, if the ground needed to be dry, we would have to do a lot of crazy things here.
Mhm.
We don't really think the ground needs to be dry. We think we could let it be a little bit higher for the reasons we laid out. And knowing how high we can let it flood will dictate the level of effort that will go into the regional approach.
And what was Little Canada's position on that issue?
They supported the FEMA recommended base flood elevation, which is up to the underside of the structure's support chassis system. And then also maintaining or providing emergency response personnel vehicle access to these homes.
Because this mobile home park doesn't have other access ways into it. I'm thinking of other emergency routes that were flooded for extended times, like Ramsey and Rice, but there were other ways to get to those neighborhoods. But the problem here is the limited access.
It's one way in, one way out.
Yeah.
Yeah, so I think, Sam, just to clarify too, so if the board agrees with that recommendation, we would look at things like, is it road raises? You know, how would we maintain emergency access? It's probably not with a storage projects, it's probably with raising of roads or removal of a structure out of the floodplain. You know, those are the kinds of things that we would bring you next for this phase 3.
Yeah, I think that's a reasonable thing, because as I recall from the work that was done, like bypass stuff was like $13 million.
Right.
And that was a few years ago. It's gonna be a long time.
Yeah.
It's not that I'm against spending that specifically, but if there's a lot of little things we can do to get them into position where even if it floods, it will reset itself because of all the things that we've done. But I also understand the need for emergency vehicle access, because that's not gonna wait for 2 days. That can happen when it happens. And that's the way it is. But taking a look at that whole thing, do we have any sense about who would be responsible for that? Is that North Star States that does that sort of stuff and we recommend it? Is it Little Canada that does it? Is it us that does it?
Well, based on how we've looked at these projects like the Keller Parkway, and this would be, we would pursue, if we followed the same line of thinking, we would pursue those projects to remove that risk from those homes because it's adjacent to our project, the Owasso Basin project.
It was like we raised Rand, we did all those things. So we dropped a lot of houses, and structures,
a lot of
out
structures.
of the floodplain by doing this.
That's a public road. That's the only difference between other projects and this one. It's private property.
Right.
Isn't it an association or
yeah,
else
we
it's
would
owned?
certainly need the cooperation of North Star Estates, but I think the reason we would pursue it as a district project is because of its proximity to our drainage systems through the Owasso Basin. The reason for the flooding is that that basin is there and not enough storage available for it.
Yeah, if you remember in the story map, some of the story map stuff we've talked about where there's different colors for structures, whether they're a local or a district structure based on why the flooding is happening. This is an example of something that we would have classified as a district issue because of its proximity to Owasso Basin.
Yep.
So we want to move forward by investigating alternates as a way to make things better and to clarify what will happen during the flood and what improvements we can make to mitigate that.
Based on the recommendations for how we identify flood risk.
And we agreed upon on the stakeholders recommended bullet points there.
Well, that's the question. If we are, let's just make a motion to follow the recommendations that are laid out in 6.0.
I'm okay with that.
Saying someone.
I will so move that we go with the recommended bullet points there in front of us.
Thank you. Second,
So moved.
okay, any further discussion? Hopefully not. Okay, all in favor, say aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Okay, thank you.
Thank
Perfect.
you.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Time moving forward.
Thanks, Sam.
Okay, so that brings us to item 10C, which has a whole bunch of things to it. First one is Lake Emily Subwatershed Regional DMP.
I don't know if you want Aaron to walk through them or if you had questions, we can take
Oh, yeah.
questions.
Yeah, I'll start. I was a little surprised at this. I didn't remember this from the past. Is this a Cottage Place again, or it's not Cottage Place again? This
No.
is
This is a different project.
it's a whole different project, because
Yeah.
Cottage Place was brought up in this.
Right, that was just to talk through it had been such a while since we've talked about this watershed that I wanted to walk folks back through where this came from and what the other projects were and kind of where they landed. So Cottage Place is mentioned, but not because we're suggesting pursuing it. And in fact, we mentioned that it's not being pursued at this time. So this is some locations where a regional filter could be put into place, and it's not the wetland.
Okay, in here you say you use the evaluation tool. Originally, there was one proposal for filtration system, and this jumped up for some reason. What caused it to jump up? That it's so much more important, spend a lot more money per pound.
Right.
And
Yep.
Do we have that tool that we can look at? Bless you.
Well, I don't have it rolled up for you tonight, but what I can say is whenever there's an option that is a superficial one and not underground, where it's visible in public land, where it can be leveraged for public education and like a site amenity, that gives it more points in the prioritization tool. And actually, we don't need to decide tonight which of those projects would be chosen. This is what we're asking for feedback on tonight is whether the approach for the study makes sense, not a commitment to build anything right now. So it's just, this is our proposed approach. This is where the study came from. Do you agree with the approach? Should we move forward? And I would say the other thing is between those two projects, one of them is more expensive per pound, but it's still within the realm of typical. And that project actually with the higher cost per pound removed is actually on the whole less expensive than the other project. So there's a few different ways to look at these two projects, but tonight you don't need to decide which project. It's just whether or not you agree with the scope we laid out.
You know,
the process.
The tool is still draft, as I understand it. It hasn't been formally adopted. And what would be helpful to me so that we could get the same experience or some experience with it would be you to lay out using the tool and the alternatives under it and the costs and how they differentiated and how you came to this one. So then we'd have more experience with it.
Okay.
So you're saying, well, so that would be part of, bringing a project forward. You would see how it is laid out on the tool.
Yeah.
So this is just saying that we would be studying, looking at opportunities to improve water quality for Lake Emily. Here's the potential projects, and here's how they lay out on the tool. Is that?
Yeah, that's what would be helpful. And I also was curious, why now? This is 6 years later. But
because when we did this study several years ago, we thought this is a project, this is an area that's worth pursuing a project because of the at-risk status of the water quality in Lake Emily, but it has never, every year since then, we have brought it up, but there have been other projects that have been deemed more important. Frankly, flood risk. I mean, we just came out of, you all know, I mean, years of a lot of flood risk reduction need. And so that project kind of has been bumped year to year. So we still feel like it's worth pursuing with the city of Shoreview and working through those steps. And then being able to bring to you, you know, whether there are projects that we recommend actually implementing or not. So it never stopped being a viable project. It's just other flood projects took precedence. And so we just brought it back up for this year.
That exactly answered my question, because I'm feeling like we've got so many projects going and it was like, why are we adding this now? But it's because you all think we've got some capacity, having some of these bigger things behind us. We can pick up some of these that have been on the table for a while.
We also said in our, so when we budgeted for 2022, this was one of the feasibility studies that we said we wanted to focus on. So, and we do feel like now is the time, you know, Aaron and I talked recently about we could really front load the year with all these scope summaries for all the things we said we would do, but we want to make sure that we, like you just said, have the capacity and are ready to move forward with that.
Yeah. But one thing I will say, Diane, just back to the prioritization tool, I think what we've been trying to do, and you saw this in the last targeted retrofit project where we brought the two, the church and the school project to you, where we said, we had a memo where we said, here's what these two projects are, here's where they rank, here's why. You know, we are trying to use that tool in the definition of these projects when we're asking the board to make an up or down vote on them. This one is not so much up or down vote on these specific projects. It's, do you agree that we can take next steps with the city and start to develop these things and then bring them back to the board for consideration when we have more specifics on something that we think would be actually constructible.
And you're thinking that's around task 4 preliminary design, or where would it come back?
I think, so let me scroll down. I haven't kept up in the board packet here. I think we mentioned that in one of the tasks. Sorry, which page are we on in the packet now?
Well,
190,
you said
it's
in
197.
Okay, thank you.
Task 5 that you presented to Shoreview and then also to us. So I'm just kind of wondering.
Yep. So task 4, so that's later this fall. We say we would do a preliminary design and 30% design plans for the regional stormwater BMP, whichever one that is. That would be developed then, and the plans would be submitted to the city and the district for review. So that would be district staff, but I would imagine that we would be bringing that to a board meeting to keep you appraised of the progress. And then task 5 in September, that's when we would be presenting to the district board for review and approval to complete the plans and specifications. So that's when we're at final design, but before we've done an actual plan set and bidding documents, we would be coming back to this board. And then after that, we would be bringing it back then to ask permission to put it out to bid. That's the typical process that we use when we bring these retrofit projects to the board. Actually, any project that we're constructing, there's typically a few points at which the board weighs in on whether we should proceed.
And we kind of give an indication tonight because we'd be committing to $78,000 of work and getting to that point.
Well, that's the total, right?
Yes. Up through the design, yeah.
Yeah.
Right, so we've already committed, or well, we've already allocated the funds to do this work through our budgeting process, right? And at that point, we would indicate that that was a need or want of the district to move forward. So right, if there's a change in that, this would be the time to say, we don't want to pursue this at this time.
Mm-hmm.
Well, I'm okay with moving forward, except for I would like to know at the next meeting. You all have had the meeting with Shoreview. What happened? What did you discuss? What did you put forward? It still isn't 100% clear to me what the two proposals are for this and why one would rank so much higher on the tool. So I would like to see at the next meeting, I'd like to see the tool and why that jumped up. And second,
Sure.
I'll get a review of what Shoreview said, because you know, what are we gonna ask them? Are you okay if we go and dig this stuff up? Or-
Well, we have a typical process when we work, you know, with our partners on these projects. So we're getting an understanding if they're supportive or if they're interested, you know, if this is a project that they want to continue
Right.
partnering with us on. You know, a reminder too, that all these projects will be in the project status report. So you certainly will see an update every month on, you know, the work that we've done before that. And I will talk about getting the information about the prioritization tool in there as well.
Okay.
Yeah, that's no problem at all. What's also nice with the cities, you know, oftentimes when we meet with the cities, it's really helpful to talk about what their CIP plans are going forward in case there's an area that they know they're going to be doing work and digging up the roadway or doing some utility work or whatever. And then we can streamline into that to make it less expensive and disruptive. And, you know, sometimes those lead to really great projects over and above what we have imagined on our own in our own corner. So it seems like a good time to reach back out to the city, and that's no problem at all. I can put information in the packet for next month about the tool and how that assesses those two projects. The Lake Emily Watershed feasibility study memo is something that we could also share. So you could see the origins of that work if you want to get down into the weeds of how we assessed that subwatershed. So
Yeah, I'd like to see it just to
okay.
bring myself back up to speed.
Yeah, it's been a while since we looked at these areas. So
Yeah, and really 4 of the 5 board members have joined since then. So
Yeah.
in those situations, it'd be especially helpful.
Right.
Sure. Yep. No problem.
So do we have a motion to move forward with this based on those caveats?
And what is the motion to
To-
do the schedule, the
yeah,
milestones and
to authorize
deliverables?
them to move forward with that. That's what they're asked for. Is to move forward with this project.
I'll say so moved.
Second? So moved. Okay. Any further discussion? All in favor, say aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Okay, you're good to go.
You.
Moving along to item 10 CII,
Yeah, Carver Ponds.
Carver Pond improvements, yep. Okay, any, this is just a study to see what, I did have one question. Are Carver Ponds natural ponds or are they built ponds?
Those are stormwater ponds. So those were built.
They're built, okay.
Yeah, they're not wetlands. They are stormwater ponds that were built, and these were discovered. So this is another example of projects that came out of a subwatershed feasibility study. So this one came out, this one and the double driveway scope summary came out of the Fish Creek subwatershed feasibility study, because that creek was during the planning process showed up to be, through evaluation of water quality data, at risk of impairment for excess nutrients. So we looked through that subwatershed, just like we looked through the Lake Emily subwatershed, to look for retrofit opportunities of projects that would decrease the phosphorus load to the creek. And so we looked at these ponds, which drain a fairly significant amount of watershed, and which appear from aerial photos and just from anecdotal evidence to be pretty nutrient rich based on the algae that we're seeing growing in those ponds. And urban stormwater ponds, and in some cases wetlands, are a little notorious for being loaders of phosphorus. So these ponds that we build to clean the stormwater as it comes through over time ends up being a source of nutrients in some cases. And so there's a growing movement of practitioners to look at ponds and wetlands in terms of the water quality benefits they provide, but also sometimes the water quality problems that they contribute to. So this is a good example of that, as is the double driveway pond project. And these projects also, well, this one in particular, the Carver Ponds one, may ultimately blend in nicely with the aeration studies that are being done, where we're looking at ponds and the effect of aeration on internal load. But this first step is looking at the nutrient dynamics in these ponds and assessing, you know, how much sediment has filled up in these areas. Is it going anoxic? Does it have low oxygen conditions that promote more release of nutrients? And just kind of getting to know these ponds on a more detailed basis. And then from there, going with trying to figure out some strategies for improving them to the
So-
benefit of Fish Creek.
So what you want from the board is go ahead and do the studies, and then it looks like after the field investigation, you'd be coming back with some recommendations and want an action from us on those.
Yeah, yep.
Okay,
Do we need a motion to
yeah, I
do
think,
the studies or
I think
just?
we do.
I guess if, yeah,
Yeah.
that's been kind of how you've been operating on things
Right.
with these, yeah.
Well, then I will move that you go ahead with the studies and come back with the background information and the field investigation by September 31st.
I have a second.
Second.
Thank you. Any further discussion? All in favor, say aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Okay, you got,
Okay, so why is it called double driveway? I have to ask that.
yeah.
Because there's two driveways.
It's not very creative.
Really
Okay.
creative naming.
Got it.
We've
Yeah.
called it double driveway ponds forever too. And we've been,
Yeah.
we've cleaned, you know, done maintenance in this area for a long time.
I thought only the MnDOT had
Yeah.
the creative naming prize.
They're more
Okay.
creative than we are.
Yeah.
All right, side trip, sorry.
More fun, yeah. So we're looking at this pond because Bailey Nursery may have poisoned it. Is that-
Well, well, so we're looking at the pond because it drains a huge tributary area and is a pond that frequently gets dredged through the district CIP maintenance program. It just so happens that there's this Department of Agriculture study going on about pesticides being mobilized off the Bailey property. So we didn't initially seek this pond out because of that study. We just found out about it as we got going. So it may be that, you know, from our perspective, it would be great if anything that we can do to trap sediment in that pond and, either make it more maintainable or do some pre-treatment that's easier to maintain before it gets into the main body of the pond. That would be our primary focus, but there may be things that come out of that Department of Agriculture study that also inform some additional pieces that other stakeholders might be interested in contributing. So this one, we're suggesting that we not go full speed ahead with the design. In fact, that budget is scaled back from what was originally budgeted because we thought, until we get that report, we can get some background information, but we should probably hold at that point until that Department of Agriculture report gets finalized so that we understand the full picture of what's coming off the Bailey Nursery property.
So all you want from us is to say, go get the background information.
So yeah, whenever we're giving you guys these scope summaries, whether it's for a water quality study or a flood risk reduction study, we're just laying out, here's what we see the project is in terms of the scope, the schedule, and the budget. And we're just asking the board whether this looks okay. So, and if it looks okay, we move forward and we check in with you at the points that we've said that we will. And it's just a way for us to make sure that the way we see the project is an acceptable way within the vision of the board.
I understand that, but this one only had like one task, and one date laid out.
Mm-hmm.
We start, we start in May and we get the task done by July. So that's why I was asking.
Yeah, this one's a little atypical because of that Department of Ag. I would have had more tasks for you if there wasn't a,
Yeah, I just am trying to figure out what you need from us.
yeah.
It really is more informational to
Okay.
say here's how we plan to move forward. If there were any red flags, you could let us know.
Well, and that was my question.
Yeah.
Do we even need a motion on this? Because it looks like after you get some background, you might have an idea of where you want to go.
Yeah, the motion is really up to you. We haven't always done motions on these.
I think it's a good idea, though, to make sure that
Sure.
it's documented.
Yep.
Well, in keeping with the rest of it, let's just make a motion. And we'll accept the portfolio of things. There isn't much else to say on that except for go ahead.
Yeah.
Right.
Yep. So that can be the motion.
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, I'll move that we move ahead. I don't have to ask for other people.
Sure, second.
Perfect.
All in favor, say aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Thank you. Okay. And on the Coleman Creek risk reduction feasibility study.
And this one probably looks a little familiar because it's a continuation of where we started last year and is really the last link in the chain of the feasibility studies that we're looking at. So this is just these areas that are downstream of the area we're talking about doing the diversion. So PCU Pond and the wetland that's west of White Bear Avenue are the ones, the focus points in this flood risk reduction study. So this lays out the timing of this study because it has to be staggered from the diversion study because the diversion study affects the magnitude of what would need to happen downstream. So yeah. This one reads like a lot of the other flood risk reduction ones that you've seen. This is just targeting specifically those areas downstream of the North St. Paul Urban Ecology Center.
Right.
And you can't get that until summer for a year from now, right? Summer 2023. Get the diversion study done.
Yeah, I mean, in that timeline, is that what we said in terms of the diversion study timeline? I don't have it in front of me, but that would make sense given all the stakeholders.
Well, we can't get the feasibility study and the preliminary sizing of the system modifications until the diversion is
Yeah.
further.
Yeah.
So we're saying we'll step into this one, but there are things from the other one that we need. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah.
Okay, I'm okay with moving forward to. Want to make a motion to move forward?
Didn't we already do that? This is a new one.
No, this
The
is
next
the-
one,
this is
the
the
last
last
one.
I'll move forward on this one too.
Thank you. Second,
I'll second.
okay, any further discussion? All in favor?
Right.
Aye. Aye. Opposed? Thank you. You got the okay on that one?
All right.
Okay,
Thanks, Erin.
Thank you.
I'll go to the administrator's report.
Yeah, I don't have a ton in here, but I have the meetings and upcoming meetings as well as we'd already talked about the action log. The last item in here is the West Vadnais Lake boundary change update. As I indicated, Larry and I attended a meeting, the Vadnais Heights City Council workshop. And then we have an upcoming meeting next Monday with the Lamo subcommittee meeting. So we'll keep answering questions and.
Yeah, and I think it went well. It seems like everybody is sort of receptive. They're a little nervous because they've always had this. But we met with the city council basically. Tina did a nice job of talking about the permitting process. And why we did talk about why we would want to accept the liabilities that go with it because it benefits us more than them. And they were understanding. They had some good questions. The one key thing to me was that I think it was a city engineer asked, are you not going to do this? Because if you're not going to do this, let's stop it right now. And the city council said, no, we haven't made a decision. but at this point, we're not saying no.
They're not putting up roadblocks.
Yeah.
They want to hear from Blamo, and then they would
Right.
make a, they weren't at a meeting, it was a workshop, so they couldn't make any.
So next Monday, we're gonna
Decisions.
have a Zoom meeting, I think it is,
Mm-hmm.
with the technical committee.
The
That's-
subcommittee of the board, so it
Oh,
was
it's a
the,
subcommittee?
yep,
Oh,
so
I
it was
thought
the,
technical.
no, it's the subcommittee of the board,
Right,
yep, on Monday.
okay, so those are the same people that appeared
Mhm.
with us a couple of meetings ago.
And then that subcommittee, the way I understand it, would make a recommendation to the full
Full
Blamo
committee.
board.
And then the full Vlamo board meets on the 22nd of June.
That's correct.
And then if they decide positively, I think they have to take it to the Madness City Council.
They don't have to at this point in time. So the way that Badness Heights comes into play is they have to approve the final boundary change. So, right, so when we go through the boundary change process,
Oh, okay,
we would approve it, Blamo would approve it, and the city has to approve it as well.
right.
But I think what I heard is that the city council would like to officially give their support of moving forward based on Blamo's recommendation.
Right, yeah.
So if Blamo says we're comfortable moving forward, and then they want the city to say, yes, we're comfortable moving forward.
Then we start
And
the
then-
process that we've
And that
already.
actually will help with Bowser too.
Yeah,
I mean,
yeah.
just to-
I mean,
yeah,
it basically means we go through the process, which is just a
Without
paperwork process,
objections.
and then
Right.
hopefully there wouldn't be any concerns
Okay.
about approving.
Good. So it's moving along.
It is, yeah.
That's the good news, or just news. Anything else from the administrator's report you want to talk about?
I don't have anything, no.
Okay. Project and program status reports. Anybody got anything on that?
Just thought the jumping worm stuff was scary and interesting.
Yeah, there's been a lot written about jumping worms, particularly people selling plants that sort of like they've grown themselves
Mhm.
and they have jumping worms in them, they don't know, and they get planted and then they're all over. Are we gonna put an educational thing on our website about this?
Yeah, I think that's a good idea. We'll do that.
Well, that, I thought that really the picture of before worms and after and the undergrowth was really disturbing.
It's
And
dramatic.
they, in the master gardener training, they showed us identical pictures on what earthworms do,
Yeah.
which are also invasive.
Mhm.
So I say kill all of them.
Heard it here.
People think earthworms are so great, but
Yeah.
you can see the devastation
Yeah.
that they've already
Yeah.
caused too. So, yeah, we should at least have something about the jumping worms, but I
Yeah.
think.
Get
all
more
of them-
robins who eat the worms.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's exactly right. They're scary little buggers, actually. One of the comments I had, though, I had one comment on the program. And that had to do with the website redevelopment.
Mhm.
She said they were gonna be posting documents from 2018 and then pulling other things. I would like to see more than 2018 pulled in. Because like tonight, we're talking about stuff from 2016. And particularly board packets, because we have reports in board packets that don't appear anywhere else. And when you go back and look at these things, you have to have those board packets to be able to look at the report that somebody's talking about.
Yeah,
So if you
I'll
can
talk to her about that.
Encourage her to pull over more than that.
Sure, I'll talk with her about that. Give you an update.
Okay. Anybody else have anything they want to talk about?
No. I move we adjourn.
Oh, I do, there is one thing. So I know next month Pam will not be here and Val will not be here.
And I was gonna ask, because every year we deal with July
I just want to
4th.
make sure that the other three of you will have a quorum for the July meeting.
Yeah, I
Okay.
have never planned to be.
Oh, I'm glad I told you because I forgot all about that.
Unless I get another surgery or something that pops up,
Right.
I need that I can't
Yeah.
avoid.
Well, if that comes up, we'll just need to make a change if maybe, but
Time, yeah,
Yeah.
okay, all right.
Yep.
I
but
don't-
at this point, the three of you
I don't
are.
anticipate a problem.
It's July 6th, I think is the meeting date.
Okay, that sounds good. Anybody else have any comments?
Well, just on that, we don't have anything super critical for July. What's our July?
So typically
remember
we
the-
start the budget with a summary memo, you know, so
Yeah,
it's not,
okay,
we're not
which
talking
they can read
numbers.
and-
Yeah, yeah.
We'll try to lighten up the,
I don't know, Erin, was there something? I should have looked at that to see what else. Well, yeah, we'll make sure that it doesn't include a lot of critical items.
Yeah, things like the budget background.
Yeah,
People can
right,
read in the
yeah,
packet. It's usually kind of a preview.
and it's the good news of having this taped on Zoom.
Yeah.
Because like when I got well enough to
Mhm.
look at the thing, I went through the whole thing. and
She
looked
was
at it.
just checking out.
Yeah.
that.
I wanted to see how she.
See how she
in my-
did.
in my Said, yeah,
That was what
expect.
that was.
She did
great.
I thought about it. I had my
I said
phone
the
with
B
me.
team had the shortest meeting.
Yeah.
I had my phone with me. I was still under heavy drugs, which
Yeah.
actually probably could help.
Did we officially adjourn? Sorry.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah.
Motion to adjourn, second,
Yep.
all in favor, aye. We're out here.
See ya.
Thanks.
Here you go, ma'am.